Hi there, this is Jaime Alejandro with the Arts Calling Podcast, the place where I interview hardworking independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. Let's get the show on the road. Today, I'm delighted to be Arts Calling author J Parsley. J Parsley is a fiction writer, poet, educator, and environmentalist who received their MFA in creative writing from the University of Texas at El Paso and makes their home in rural Kentucky with their beautiful devil cat, Griffin. He is a 2024 Artist in Residence at Worm Farm Institute and Art Farm, and their work has been published or is upcoming in Silk Road Review, Screen Door Review, Animally, Bird Code Quarterly, The New Flash Fiction Review, and various other places in print and around the internet. Their poetry chapbook, The Anonym Gospels, won the 2023 Apogee Poetry Award and is available through April Gloaming Publishing. Their debut novella, You From Below, is now available from Split Lip Press. Folks, you're in for a treat. J Parsley's You From Below burrows into the ecological, economic, and emotional state of Central Appalachia to examine its past, present, and the nature of reciprocity through this speculative, introspective, fable-like exploration of collapse and regeneration. This is a phenomenal read, and I urge you folks to go check it out. Now, without further delay, let's give MJ a call. Hi, MJ. Good evening. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Oh, I'm wonderful. First and foremost, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. I know everyone's busy, but it's certainly appreciated. I'm definitely excited to get rolling on the conversation. But before I talk about your work, which I had the pleasure of reading, You From Below, which is a wonderful novella that you have coming out, or is it out already?
It is coming out in February, but it is being shipped currently. So there are people who have it in their homes.
Perfect timing. Perfect timing. Well, I'm certainly excited to talk about it because there's so many threads to pull from this piece, and it was a very exciting read. But I kind of want to get a sense of where you started as a writer, and maybe we can sort of start at the beginning with you. You mentioned in your acknowledgments, and you had a great acknowledgement in there, but the home dirt, which is a great sort of phrase that you mentioned. And I'm curious, where is that for you? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, I was born in Florida. I was born in St. Petersburg, Florida. That's where my dad's family is. But my mom's family is all from Kentucky. And I spent most of my summers in Kentucky most of the time. And so when I was a teenager, we moved to Kentucky more permanently. And that's sort of where I consider to be my home dirt. It's where I live currently. I've come and gone since then, but currently I'm back in Kentucky. Yeah.
No, that's great to hear. And moving when you're a teenager certainly seems like a super disorienting time, but it's just such a formative time that it's baffling that you can make the adjustment in that situation. So what was that like, changing locations at that pivotal point in time? Because it's amazing, an amazing time.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I've always loved Kentucky a lot, so that definitely helped with the transition, knowing that I was going to a place that just every time I went, in the summer as a kid, I was just always really, really happy to be here. I was always very enchanted with, it's very different from Florida. Florida is beautiful and I love it a lot, but there are no hills and mountains in Florida. There are no fireflies in Florida. These are the sort of things that as a kid I was just absolutely enchanted with every time I came to Kentucky. So I think, it definitely was a difficult transition. But Yeah, I don't know. I think in a way, I settled into this place as a home in a way I didn't in Florida.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you kind of went there because I feel like there's so many wonderful mentions in your writing, from what I've read about this home turf,
Mm,
and it seems like it's such a beautiful through line with this piece. And so do you feel like the investment in the environmental concerns came out of those formative years, or is a concern for the environment something that happened much later in life? What was it that kind of drew you to that concern,
mm,
to look at the environment for what it is, and sort of our interaction as human beings with it?
yeah. I think concern came later as I got older and realized how we were in dire straits. But the love of the environment, the love of nature, was definitely always there. It is one of the things that I look on very nostalgically when it comes to like what I miss about Florida. Is it's a beautiful place for wildlife. It's a beautiful place environmentally. I know people, of course, always think of the beaches, but I'm a big fan of swamps personally. And so that was very much instilled in me as a young age. In a young age.
So you were looking for those kinds of environments, right? Like you sort of organically felt like, I'm an outside person. I
Yeah,
need to be out where nature is. Okay.
for sure.
Wonderful.
I was homeschooled as a kid, so I was very much like the moment I was done with my schoolwork, I was outside and exploring. So yeah.
What were you reading at the time when you were growing up? We can go back as far as you can, but I'm mostly
Sure.
curious, like what kind of words made you feel like you were being infected with storytelling?
Mm.
you know, Not that I think it's a disease, but
It's a little
what were
bit, you
those
know.
things? Yeah, yeah.
um, the very first book I can remember reading and being like really aware of the craft of writing, I guess. Like I read it and I was aware of the like techniques that the author was using, and I was like, oh, I want to do this. Was
Mhm.
a Kate DiCamillo book. She's a wonderful children's author. So it was The Tale of Despero, which is about a little mouse in a
Mm,
castle. It's a very whimsical little story, but um, she wrote in a way that was like speaking really directly to the reader. Um,
mm,
and yeah, I probably read it when I was, I don't know, 10 or 11 maybe. And I was
mm.
always a big reader. Read a ton of stuff, but that was the first time I remember consciously looking at a writing technique and being like, I gotta do this. Like,
What's the thing you remember writing the earliest? Do you have a recollection of when poetry came to you, or like what kind of stuff you were writing when you
mm,
first made the foray into it?
yeah. Well, as far as poetry, I'll come back to when I started that, but writing stories, I have been writing stories for probably as long as I've been able to write enough words to string together a story. I remember writing a lot of stories about animals when I was little. Like I wrote a story about a little frog or mice. Usually, I was very obsessed with mice. Um, very
Why
very animal
mice?
centric.
I guess, not to make you sort of psychoanalyze the mice, but I just think there's such a frailty, but yet sort of like resistance. They're very resilient, sturdy creatures. So
Yeah.
I'm curious if, like, looking back, are you like, what was that all about?
Yeah. I honestly, I don't know. I've never psychoanalyzed it, but I did love stories about mice. I had lots of little like stuffed animal mice. Um, that honestly might have been where it started. It was my favorite stuffed animal was a little mouse. So maybe
Mm,
it stemmed
yeah.
from that. But yeah.
So you started pretty early, and there was sort of an interest in not necessarily anthropomorphizing, these animals or things like that, but you were just very aware of the environment and the creatures within it. So I asked about poetry because you did release a poetry collection before this. So I guess I wanted to know if these two things were sort of in competition with you. If you arose as a writer of prose from poetry, or if it was the other way around.
Yeah.
Because the work, and we're about to get to it, it was just such a delight because of that lyrical quality. But I'll let you start there just for a moment.
Yeah. So my journey to poetry was I didn't really read any poetry growing up. I really didn't read poetry even like as a college student where my major was English. You would have thought I would have encountered at least some of it. And I did a little bit, but I started writing poetry and reading poetry seriously, not just occasionally, in grad school. I went to the University of Texas in El Paso and got my MFA there. And they force you to eat your vegetables in grad school. and they say, I know you're here as a fiction writer, but you got to write poetry too, just for a little while. And I was very intimidated by that. And a couple weeks into our like introduction to poetry writing class, something clicked in my brain and I was like, oh, this is incredible. I love this.
What made it click? What made it click? I'm curious. Like if you can pinpoint maybe a moment of eureka there, or what were you reading that made you feel that spark?
If I'm remembering correctly, as far as reading, we were reading something I had already read before, which was Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. It was one of the only pieces of poetry I had ever read. And so I was like already familiar with it, but I was coming to it from this new like analytical perspective and like actually trying to like look at it and be like, okay, what works here? Why is this one of the only things of poetry I've ever read that I was like, oh, I get it. I love this. So I think reading, Walt Whitman was when it started to click. And then for writing, I think it was like the professor started us out with sonnets, which is a cool thing to start beginner poets because you have that structure, right? And I wrote a sonnet and I was aware that it was not good, but I didn't know how to write a good sonnet. And once we got past the structure, I still think it's a good place to start. But once we got past that structure and I was sort of able to play around, I realized how much like space there was to play around with line breaks and changing meaning that way. And I just became, I don't know, I guess I just became aware of what a fun space verse can be. Like, yeah.
No, well, that's a wonderful education because I ask, because all roads lead to the novella, which is You from Below. And it's fascinating because you say, well, I didn't read poetry until later, but it is embedded in the fabric of the novella. And it's surprising to me because it does read, and I hate to say lyrical, but I'm out of words, for this one. It does flow in such a way that it carries a different cadence than traditional prose. And maybe this would be a good time to sort of start setting the stage for what this novella is about, because there's so much to discover. And I think what better way to introduce it than to have the author give us sort of like the intro to You from Below. What is this story and how does it begin, so that people kind of have a sense of what it is?
Yeah. You from Below is about a unnamed person. The whole book is written in second person, so it is you. It begins with the collapse of your town, which is on the edge of a mountain, and you have to climb this mountain with nothing but a envelope with a letter in your pocket, and you don't know why, but you have to take this letter to the top of the mountain. And along the way, you meet all sorts of people who tell you their stories. Yeah.
To just kind of add to it, it's such a phenomenal ride into the surreal. It is fable-like. It is there's a touch of magic there, but it is honest in its craziness, I think. But I hope you don't mind me calling it crazy, but it's just,
no, it's
it's
great.
heightened and surreal in such a way that it feels so honest. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to share like this little scenario that you have and it's at the beginning, but it might be one of my favorite things ever, where you have this protagonist who is you're experiencing through the second person, and they arrive to meet the beekeeper, who is all studded out in the beekeeper suit, and they have tea together as the stories are being shared. And one of the greatest things ever was this line where you called it the pantomime of domesticity. Just in terms of like, there was such a contradiction happening in that the second person sort of separates you from what's happening, but as you're watching this sort of performance, it felt more honest. It felt more like, oh, we're more exposed now. So I don't know how you did that. That was just wonderful. But I think it's in the bizarreness of it. So maybe we can talk about tone and how you arrive at this sort of these mechanisms to get the point across, because it was so well done throughout. And that was just sort of like one of the first character introductions that I just loved. But maybe you could elaborate on how the bizarre can become like a way to get to the honesty, to the normal, because I find that so fascinating, and you do it so well here.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, this is a good question. I think one of the things I love about writing, I don't even know what genre, like you called it, folkloric or something, which I think is
fable-like or folk. Yeah, I'm sure there's elements there. Yeah.
Yes, fable-like, folkloric, speculative, magical realism, whatever. But I think taking something very bizarre, very strange, and writing it as if it is standard is, I don't know, in my brain, it's like, it's the way to ground anything strange, is to be like, yeah, here's this thing. It may seem crazy, but we're going to treat it like it's completely normal. Maybe that's just me not wanting to explain things. I don't know.
No, but this is perfect. And I'm sorry that I kind of put you in a corner in that situation, because I totally understand how playful it is. And the more you explain it, the less playful it becomes, and it sort of takes away from it. But maybe with an example, because I love my favorite thing that happened in that exchange was literally them having the tea, and the tea just going onto the suit of the beekeeper. Like, they're not even drinking the tea, and it was glorious and amazing. But here's the concern, though. It's like, with a work like this, how do you retain a sense of direction without getting lost in these images and these beautiful moving passages that might feel like they're sort of like meandering, but you get us there. You don't get lost, but you still kind of get the sense that, like, I'm not sure where this is going to go. So how did you structure this? How did you find sort of the form for it? If maybe we could talk about some of those nuts and bolts instead.
Yeah, it is interesting for this book in particular, because generally when I write fiction, I start with a character or an environment or something like that. And for this, like, the structure just sort of came together all at once, and I was like, oh, this has to happen, and then this has, and I was, at the time, I was very obsessed with an ancient storytelling structure. It's called chiastic storytelling. CHI. It's a Greek word.
Okay.
And the idea with chiastic structure is that you have like an event in the center, and then you have events rippling out from the center of the story that mirror each other.
Okay.
Um, and this story is not quite chiastic because by the time you edit things,
Sure.
it changes a little.
Right.
But I was really interested in this idea that you can have these events that are sort of mirroring each other. You have this like the rise and the descent, and the rapture and the landslide, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's what really kept me like grounded in what is, a meandering storytelling style where you have
Mm-hmm.
a place you're trying to go with it, both literally, they're trying to get to the top of the
Mm-hmm.
mountain, and sort of metaphorically with wanting this rise and fall to sort of constantly be a part of the structure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was so effective because it does become like a heartbeat in that sort of like rise and fall. Each story sort of mimics that feeling where we're sort of Sisyphean, I guess, or something.
Yeah.
You're repeating a similar task, but you're still moving forward. And that was such a treat. But how long did you have to work on this? Like how did the revision process take you from what it is and kind of where you started? Because you said that, obviously rewrites and changes, stuff like that.
Mhm.
How did it evolve from you and how far did you stray from that original concept? If we can
Mm.
elaborate on some of those, because I know there might be, we can keep it spoiler free.
Yeah. As far as the original concept goes, I think the biggest change, which as far as spoiler free goes, is not very spoiler free, but the ending is what changed the most.
Mm,
But what happened is I wrote all but the last chapter, the first draft of it, in the span of like 2 or 3 weeks, I think. And then
mm,
I didn't touch it for months, and I didn't know what to do with the ending, and I didn't know how to write it. And I wrote it, and then I rewrote it, and all this stuff. I think the main thing that changed in everything before the last chapter was as I was editing it, I just kept putting more and more like environmental descriptors, and I
mhm,
wanted the sense of uh, the sense of place in the Appalachian Mountains, and I wanted specificity. And so I just kept going back and adding more and more specificity of um, trees and flowers and animals, and
right.
I wanted it
Yeah.
really, yeah.
Yeah, and definitely the descriptors, and as you're going through from one visitation to another, you're meeting all kinds of people, but throughout that, it's lush with like the setting, and I
Mhm.
love how you were able to kind of transmit that because I guess at the beginning, when we first started talking, I almost wanted to ask you how much of this is an ode to your home dirt and the place where you grew up because it's vibrant and there's stuff like the types of vines and the woods and the lumber and these kinds of very specific descriptors of your home turf, and I'm wondering to what degree do you feel like it is an ode
Yeah,
to the place that you know.
yeah. I think it definitely is a bit of a love letter to Appalachia. I feel like a lot of my writing is kind of a love letter to Appalachia. So I don't know if that's super specific to this book. But I think what I wanted specifically in terms of place and this book was there is a harm that has been done to this region that at times feels irreversible. I don't believe it to be fully irreversible, but um, and I really wanted to delve into that harm and what some of the causes were and what hope looks like at the end of that.
There's plenty of hopelessness displayed,
Mm,
but I think that there is a moment where the conversation about home and place, which is so vivid throughout the whole piece, starts to say mend itself, and this
mm,
idea of hope, like how much of it can be a dream and how much of it is like actual reality that we can bring to life. It's
Mhm.
such a tricky thing to ask, I imagine, when you're dealing with kind of the fantastical, but
Mhm.
laying these different sort of crumbs of hope throughout the whole thing. And again, like, to keep it spoiler free, I don't want to go into the specifics because the characters are so well drawn out and they convey that kind of hope, but at the same time, there's degrees of hopelessness throughout the piece that are really heartbreaking, but so well done. But
Yeah.
maybe you can talk about that because it is important to consider that, like,
Mhm.
balance of, are you going to tell it like it is, quote unquote, or are you going to give us a little bit of hope for tomorrow and what can be done, or a way to dream?
Yeah. I I think what I want to do in my writing and in this book is like I never want the hope that I'm trying to end on to feel unfounded or to feel wistful. I want
Mhm.
it to be a very grounded thing. And the idea that hope is not something that's like, oh, I hope this gets better one day.
Yeah, yeah.
um, but it's something you have to actively work towards. And I think hope that I have for Appalachia and for um, my home in general is that
Mhm.
we have to work very hard to get to something that will be, I guess, good for everyone. Yeah.
Sure, sure. In your locale, and I'm curious just because in here in Wyoming, we have a lot of mining. So I'm curious
Mhm.
what kind of environmental concerns are happening around your home turf? Is it something similar to that, like mining companies, or is it other concerns that are happening over there?
Mining is definitely historically a huge problem, and to this day still is.
Mhm.
The coal mines of eastern Kentucky and up into West Virginia and even like Pennsylvania um, are, infamous, I think. Um, so there's issues with the coal mining that is still happening. There's been mountaintop removal mining, so it
Mm.
just completely devastates the area
Oh, wow.
ecologically. Yeah.
Mm.
Um,
So that must be like a visceral experience. I mean, I know
mm,
for a fact when we go up to Gillette, which is a couple of hours from here, they have one of the largest open, sort of pit kind of mining situations over there. And it
mm,
literally looks like the apocalypse. It looks like
yeah.
something came out of the earth and just left this huge chasm of destruction in its wake. And I
Yeah.
think from an emotional standpoint, how does that linger within you and your writing? How does it propel you to start writing, or did you feel like you sort of been carrying that for a while and you've wanted to write about it but maybe couldn't
Mm.
find a way to do it?
I think as far as the environmental goes in Kentucky, the coal mines are our most like famous environmental issue. I don't currently live in Eastern Kentucky. I live in Central
Mhm.
Kentucky. And so I think a lot of what I was first interested in and first thinking about was agricultural. There's a lot of
Mm, okay.
agriculture and there's a lot of horse stuff that happens in Central Kentucky.
Oh, really?
And we are, yeah, um, big horse racing industry.
Ah.
We are destroying our environment in a much more subtle way in Central Kentucky because there's lots of monoculture farming, and because it's so focused on all these $1 million racehorses,
Wow.
there's a lot of pastures that have just been, totally dedicated to that. It's just,
Oh, wow.
invasive grass just all across.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think that's what first drew me in was this place that is really beautiful to look at. Like people come to this area and it's these gorgeous grassy rolling hills and there's these beautiful horses everywhere and there's these
Mhm.
lines and lines of stone fences from the 1800s, and it's a really gorgeous place. And then you start thinking about it from a ecological perspective, and it's not sustainable, and it's not good for the environment.
There's certainly a price.
There's a price for this very cultivated beauty that we've created here. So I'm really trying to contrast, like, or in my writing, a lot of what I do is I contrast that with some of the beauty I see in places in Eastern Kentucky that are less cultivated, but just really, really like, I don't know, maybe visceral or primal almost. Like,
yeah. That definitely tracks now that you mention that, because there is a degree of wildness that within this cycle that you're writing about, in the reclaiming or the destruction, there is sort of you have wonderful lyrical bits in the piece where you're sort of talking in that kind of language that emphasizes that untamed wildness, if you will, of the environment, which is really, really beautiful. But I'm curious, as you were developing this, were there some major roadblocks technically as you were writing this where you said, like, I can't figure this out? Like, what was the one thing that kind of stumped you as you were working on this that turned out to be like your biggest issue, but perhaps the most rewarding piece of like writing, like a writing solution? Like, how did that go?
Yeah. The thing that stumped me the most, and this is a pattern for me, was really the ending, because I didn't have an ending in mind when I wrote it. I had a really good idea of everything leading up to like the very last moments. And my initial ending, no specific spoilers, but my initial ending was much bleaker.
Oh darn, we didn't get to see the bleak ending. That's a bummer.
And I kept reading it, and I was like, I don't know if I want this to be the thing that people take away from this. So I think that was the thing that I kept coming back to, and being like, I don't know how to end this. I don't know how to wrap up my back and forth between hope and despair,
Right. Did you have these conversations with the folks at Split Lip, or were you sort of resolving these things before you sent it out for submission?
The very end, that was something I resolved with the editors at Split Lip. We were doing some bulk editing right in the beginning when they first accepted it. I went to them and I was like, I don't know about this ending, guys. How are we feeling? I'm starting to think it's a little too much.
That development process, it seems like it was a pretty amicable experience. You had some good support there. What was that like, just kind of putting it together, and now on the verge of seeing it coming out into the world? Like, what's your thought on it? How do you feel about the pre-release or the eve of release? What's kind of like keeping you up at night right now?
The process was really incredible. The folks at Split Lip are awesome. They're so supportive. And I've always found the publication process to be very mystifying. And they made it very simple and straightforward. Leading up to its like official publication, one of the things that I've found most interesting as people have started to receive their books and then like text or email me and be like, I got it, and they start reading it. I'm really, really enjoying seeing what chapters stick out to people, or like what characters. There's a new character every chapter, basically. And I'll have people email me and be like, "Oh, I really loved the beekeeper," and I'm like, "Oh, that wasn't the one that I thought you were gonna say," And it's really fun to see maybe psychoanalyze my friends a little bit.
No, that's great
about
because I think, listen, if you're in the process of monetizing, I think you could do a personality quiz based on the entities that are met along the way. I mean, I think that's a great opportunity. And actually now I'm going to take a moment to think about like, which one do I identify with the most, or which one would I like
yeah,
to, like have tea with? It's probably the beekeeper.
right.
I'm just,
Yeah.
I'm just throwing that out there. But they were all just such like phenomenal explorations of a lot of the themes that you were looking to discuss in it. And I mean, I'm just delighted that I got a chance to read it because it certainly
Mm,
makes for a very rewarding conversation. Now I have only like a couple of questions to be mindful of your time here, but
mm,
you're a gardener, so
mhm.
it feels like you have a sort of like an earthen connection there, and I think it shows in the writing. I mean, I don't know, maybe you might feel differently, but there is an earthenness to the work. And I'm curious how that sort of bleeds into the work that you do, because that's gotta have an impact, right?
For sure. Yeah. Um, yeah. So my like job, the thing that makes me be able to pay rent, is I work on a farm, and I work on a farm that also has a bunch of community gardens, and like you
Mm,
pick gardens, and it's really really interesting, and it's really rewarding when I am someone who is writing about the environment a lot, to be actually out in the environment on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things I've really been interested in and enjoying lately is the community gardens, because I've lived mostly extremely rurally for for a lot of my life, and these community gardens are in Lexington, and they're in a city, and so that urban environmentalism is a different perspective that I'm suddenly like, oh wow, there was a whole lot of stuff I wasn't thinking about before. Um, and so I've been really enjoying getting to understand that a little better, and thinking about environmentalism from that perspective. But it definitely affects my
yeah,
writing.
yeah. Do you think that because this was such a great marriage of idea and presentation, where you were able to
Yeah.
sort of like showcase the narrative through these really like I don't want to say outlandish, but beautifully bizarre kind of like
Sure.
ways, poetic ways, if you were to make like say a foray into more like urban
Mm,
environmentalism, like do you feel like this voice is very much how you intend to go forward? I mean, I'm all for it because it's just a wonderful way to present stories like this. It's probably my favorite way to talk about these difficult issues,
mm,
through magic, through poetry, through the lyricism of
mm.
these things. Like, can you talk about environmentalism in in another way, or do you feel compelled to look at it from a different I guess perspective of like aesthetic? Maybe that's the question.
Mhm. That's a great question. I am currently definitely still focused on this sort of, I think maybe an outside person might call it magical realism. I've been thinking of it as very like folklore centric, because again, going back to like place and region, Appalachian folklore is very much a thing, and very cool to read. And I've been incorporating a lot of that into my writing. So I don't currently see much of an aesthetic change in my writing. I think I the way that I write is that, like, or so far has been like every 5 or 6 years I'll be like, okay, I'm gonna try something new. um, but right now I'm still very much on this aesthetic bend.
Well, that's not a bad place to be. And lastly, as we wrap up here, I ask folks, and I think this is pretty timely. We're still at the beginning of the year. I tend to ask folks what they do to maintain their quality of life, because I know that a lot of creative podcasts they tend to just highlight the hustle, or maybe highlight some of
Mm.
the how do you achieve this or that. But as a regular working class person, I'm mostly curious on how you maintain your quality of life to recharge, to be sustainable? What's your
Mm,
practice in such a way that you can sort of replenish, and what keeps you going?
yeah. I've found, especially over the last couple years, finding a community wherever I'm at, and being very consistent with interacting with that community is really important. So over the past couple years, it's mostly been scenes that are centered on folk music and often folk dance, or not necessarily even always
Mm.
folk dance. Like if you're familiar with like contra dancing, it's kind of like square dancing.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Uh, um, I find a lot of community in like Berea has an incredible folk music and folk art and like contra dancing scene, and I love being able to go there and dance and play music and sing with those people. I do consider that a part of my like artistic practice, but it's something that's so rejuvenating, as opposed to some parts of the artistic process can be pretty draining. But yeah, it's a really important part of the way I sustain myself.
Well, I think that about does it. But I guess I want to thank you for You From Below, which is a brilliant, beautifully crafted, surreal and magical story that is very timely, but it's a delight to read first and foremost. So I definitely urge people to go and check it out. And it's coming out from Split Lip Press on
February 4th,
February 4th.
2025.
And I'll make sure to have the links in the episode description so folks can check it out. But MJ, congratulations. It's a great piece of writing, and I wish you the best, and I hope that you continue at it, because it's wonderful to be able to talk about these issues in the way that you're talking about them. So I appreciate your time, and I hope we get to chat soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Well, I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I'll be in touch on the internet, okay?
All right, sounds great. Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.